Good morning, or good afternoon, or evening to everyone. I'd like to welcome Allan Lambert and say that it's a great pleasure to facilitate this webinar with Allan, whom I've known personally for over 25 years and is a reference to everyone in the water industry. Thank you, Allan, for agreeing to attend this 50 anniversary celebration IWA webinar. I'm supposed it's supposed to be a really informal interview with some questions that we received beforehand by email. And if we have time in the end, we can answer further questions from the audience. If you want to send a question, please use the chat box in the bottom of the page and send the question to everyone, not just to the presenter, considering that I'll be reading them in the end. Although I'm sure it needs no introduction to all water industry professionals, let me introduce Allan to you all. Allan Lambert has 60 years water management experience in 50 countries, initially in hydrology, water resources development in operations, flood warning consultancies for World Meteorological Office, and then in 1980, increasingly in international non-revenue water management. A past president of the British Hydrological Society, he developed component analysis, background and bus estimates when representing Welsh Water during the UK National Leakage Control Initiative from 1992 to 94. And was then special advisor on water resources and leakage management to the House of Commons Environment Committee in 95-96 draft. He chaired the first IWA Water Loss Task Force from 95 to 99, which developed the IWA International Best Practice Water Balance and Performance Indicators published in 99 and 2000. A fellow of IWA and Sylvan, he has continued for a further 25 years to contribute numerous key concepts to the IWA Water Loss Specialist Group, in particular emphasis on KPIs and pressure management, disseminated through multiple papers and presentations to free-to-all leak switch library websites and water loss research and analysis software and training materials. So, Allan, what made you change from the hydrology to non-revenue water?
Well, I was very happy in my time doing hydrology and water resources, and I thought I'd just do that all my life. I enjoyed it so much working in North Wales, which is a beautiful place. We finished optimizing conjunctive use of many different sources to increase yields and increasing the yield of the regulated River Dee, and done a particularly interesting groundwater, artesian groundwater scheme for the available fluid. And then there was reorganization and we became multi-purpose. And I was invited rather strongly to move into operations and have a spell in operations on water distribution and supply. Didn't know much about it at all, starting from scratch. And I found the leakage control very interesting because none of the standard ideas seem to work in North Wales. And so with a very good team, a very enthusiastic team all working together, we started to do some exploration ourselves and try and develop some new ideas. As a result of some stuff that we published, I became the Welsh Water representative on the managing leakage study in the UK. And technical secretary. I'm very comfortable with statistics and so on. And then I became more and more interested in it because having spent millions and millions of pounds on developing water resources for the area and for Merseyside and so on, we're coming across these figures as 20 or 25% leakage was normal. I just started to think, well, what does this mean? 25 to 25%. That means we're investing these huge sums in capital works and losing 25% of the water. And so I really started to get into the subject and found that there was not much in the way of reliable concepts underpinning the understanding of it, particularly physical concepts. And so, frankly, I just got hooked on it. And then when we came up with the managing leakage reports, I had the chance to meet colleagues from all of the other water utilities in the UK and exchange ideas. And those 5 years were very successful, but they just whetted my appetite to go and try some of the ideas abroad. And I was fortunate enough to get a job with World Bank in Bahamas, would you believe? My first job, which was quite nice. I thought, this is okay, I could put up with this. And then it just graduated from there. And I met many wonderful people, some of whose names I mentioned to you, but there's many more. And my particular interest has always been to form a bridge between academics and practitioners. And I used to see big gaps in that in water resources, and I saw even bigger gaps in that in leakage control. So I've always tried to sit somehow between the two. I can do the academic stuff, but I'm not interested in showing what is the most phenomenal equation I can come up with or something like that. I want something that can be that people on the ground, practitioners, the guys right down to the people in the depot, things they can hang on to and understand and put those things to them in a form they could use. And I've just found so many of those things that I could research and implement. And then when you're getting on like I am, and when I was getting into my 70s, I realized time is short. So we formed Leak Street Library. Well, Leak Street first and Leak Street Library, and put on hundreds and hundreds of papers and different stuff by people to disseminate it out. And at one time we had huge numbers on that, and it just became too big for us. So it's just been a rocket ride for 25 years. Fantastic. So that's why I changed. I should have retired at 55 in 1995, and I'm still here in 2025 with Kate now carrying on the good work and doing a fantastic job. And I just sit in the background and come up with the occasional idea, and I'm happy to see the way things are moving. So that's why I changed, and that's why I retired more times than Frank Sinatra.
And we do have someone has unmuted themselves, and I can't mute him. We do have a question here, and it's about, it's not the questions that we received before, but it's just what you were talking about. Corey is saying that after the, and I was supposed to say that here now, after delivering the EU reference document Good Practices on Leakage Management in 2014, you mentioned you would retire, but in 25 you're still here? Still you are here and very active. What kept you motivated? What are the key topics from the last decade? And I should say, Cor, that he told you he's retiring in 2014, but I was pregnant in 2005 and I flew to San Francisco to meet him because he was retiring last time. We actually don't let him get some rest or something like that. Can you say something, Allan? And what are the key topics from the last decade?
Well, there were so many, and sometimes I must pick out which is the most important. And they're all important, and it's like understanding leakage is like a huge jigsaw. Well, when you start off, it's just like a huge blank jigsaw. It has a certain dimension, a length and a width. But we have to start off almost, not quite, with no picture to work to. So we didn't know what the picture was. No idea of the shapes or whatever, and we've been filling in little bits of the jigsaw like you do. You start on the outside, and then gradually you work in, add other bits to it, And then you see you're getting somewhere eventually, and then you keep on going until you get the full picture. And we haven't got the full picture yet, so that there is still a lot of work to do. And particularly when we try to do these things internationally, we've got to try and better understand how there are differences in different countries, different terminology. We've come some way in the RDA standard water balance and so on. And there are some very interesting things happening now in terms of training materials, where you can get automatic translations from English of training materials into many, many different languages. Kate's exploring that at the moment. But putting it simply, when you're having such fun, how can you possibly stop? That's it. You know, how can you possibly stop when it's so much fun working with so many nice, motivated people?
Yeah, that's perfect. And now going back to the script, I understand we have like a timeline for the Rio losses milestones. I'd like you to say something about this. Let me start sharing this. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's here.
Okay, this is just some kind of a little diagram to show us the path I've been taking with some particular milestones on it since 1994. So we start up with what I'd learned up to 1994 and the publication of the managing leakage reports in the UK. And then I started to spread my wings a bit, and I can't quite read that. It says a night flow component analysis, and just a moment. Average zone point and night day factors. That was working with a lot with Stuart Tor on that. We did a contract in the UK, and then it works through. And I've tried to deal with put the questions within that sequence, so you can see how they happened historically. They one thing builds on another, another door opens up, and so on. And you see there are other things that you need to know. And so we work our way down to pressure management and so on. So it's a handy little slide to give reference to some of the questions that have come up. Okay.
That's perfect. Let me stop sharing this. So back to the questions here. The first question is from Terry Duffy. Do you have any guidance or thoughts on using advanced acoustic leak detection utilizing AI to locate leaks on predominantly sand soil conditions with a PVC pipe?
Well, Terry, thanks for the question, but I've got bad news and good news for you. So I'll give you the bad news first. This is not at all my speciality. I've known about these problems for many years now from colleagues, but I don't go into this field at all. I'll leave it to other experts in the water loss specialist group, and hopefully Stuart Hamilton and Charles Lambert will be sitting in this hot seat in webinars to come. They're the people who can really, I think, help you or put you in the right direction on this. They did a very good a paper report on this some years ago for WLSG. But sorry, this is not my competence, and I know my limit, and I don't go beyond this.
Thank you, Alan. The next one, Stuart Rowe is saying that he was with you in London the night you came up with the BABE concepts and worked closely with you on developing and promoting it. He fully supports the concept of awareness, location, and repair times and the impact of pressure on the component of leakage. However, for over 10 years now, he's been looking into the assumptions on background leakage. What are your current thoughts? is this concept of background leakage still relevant, and are the estimates still valid?
Well, hi, Stuart. And
Sorry to
Stuart
put
and
you
I
on the
worked.
spot, Alan.
It's
Sorry to
okay.
give you an awkward question.
We've had many conversations about this. We moved this question up because there was another question about UARL, and we thought it would be better to say a little bit about BABE concepts first before moving on to UARL. In fact, with my background in hydrology and water resources, I've been able to look at some of the concepts which you use there. And this particular one came from water balance of river catchment areas, trying to assess evaporation losses from river catchment areas by looking at the difference between the rainfall and the measured river flows and so on. What I was working in Geneva, in fact, just a little bit before the time Stuart mentioned, one very wet weekend on a job for the World Met Office. And I wondered if I could modify a concept which had been developed by two UK scientists in the 1950s. They were called Penman and Monteith. And the Penman formula is very famous in the UK for this. And that was to assess seasonally varying evaporation losses from catchment areas. They recognised that there were three quite different components that made up evaporation. The first one was the interception of rainfall on tree canopies and vegetation, and then the re-evaporation. So that's an intermittent situation. The second is continuous evapotranspiration from the ground through rooted vegetation. And the third one is direct evaporation from open water. Now, each of those components has different factors that affect them and different combinations. So there are things like earth and ground temperature, solar radiation, wind run, how much radiation is reflected from different surfaces, relative humidity, and so on. And that's the kind of problem that the hydrologists have to deal with. So I've always been very comfortable with the idea of digging deep into a problem, trying to sort out the physics of it, and then reconstructing the problem to bring it back to something which is workable and simpler. And I sort of thought, why not try classifying distribution leakage into three classes? Background, which is continuous, and the sum of multiple small leaks that run continuously, but you can't actually detect them. Individual detectable bursts, which have different average flow rates on different parts of the distribution infrastructure, and which of course vary with pressure, and different run times depending on whether they're reported or unreported, or influenced by utility policies for time of awareness, location, repair of detectable leaks. And what I did was to use that matrix to look at a water balance. And the first one I did was for Stan Bessie of Bristol Water. And the results were very, very encouraging. So I presented them and we talked about the National Leakage Control Initiative. We tested them then with a lot of the National Leakage Control data we collected in the 5 years. And we had the input ideas, several colleagues, notably Stuart, John Morrison, Dave Pearson, and Arthur R. Scott, who contributed a lot to those. And we used it to interpret much of the data. It was still basic in some respects, but it was a big step forward. And then the 1995 Managing Leakage Reports derived average values for background leakage, as in the UK in 1993 to 95. And at that time, leakage was relatively high because we found a lot of unrepaired service pipe bursts. So there's a very big service pipe burst component. And we made estimates of what would be the average background leakage at 50 meters pressure, and also an estimate of a low value. Now, when we had the first Idle Water Loss Task Force, I compared these with German data and some data I had from New Zealand, Australia, and so on, different countries. And we found that the low values were being achieved in other countries. And so broadly speaking, the IWA Water Loss Task Force and the figures that go into the UARL are based upon largely the low values from the UK, some German data, and other figures. Now, I stopped working in the UK. Stuart and I worked together for about 3 or 4 years, very closely, and then I was travelling more and more. Around 2001, the UK industry decided to standardise the background leakage estimates using values which are rather closer to the 1995 average values. And this meant that, unfortunately, our estimates of background leakage in the UK and the IWA values have differed ever since that time. And so we ended up that we had different infrastructure condition factors and different parameters. Now, coming to the last sort of answer to Stuart's question, I'm still very comfortable with using the IWA assumptions for unavoidable background leakage when applied to large systems. I do accept that when you're doing tests on small DMAs, and particularly because background leakage is tremendously sensitive to pressure, then you can get in occasions where you will find values that are less than the low values at a particular pressure that we assume. Now, hopefully, there can be some reconciliation of this because Ofwat has, since 2019, Dave Pearson and I persuaded Ofwat to at least start calculating the UARL. And I hope we may see soon some ILI values for UK utilities, calculated on the same basis as many other countries. From largely unpublished data I've seen in UK over the years, I've got little doubt that a significant number of UK utilities will now be achieving ILIs of less than 1.5. Which is in the Limburger performance band A1 of less than 1.5, or in band A2, which is 1.5 to 2. So yes, I accept it does happen, but for something which is now embedded internationally in so many countries, it would have to be a very serious error for us to think about changing that on an international scale. And we must accept that whatever figures we're using with these equations, they apply best to big systems rather than small systems, because you'll see later with some of the work we've done that you can get huge diversity in smaller systems like DMAs. So I hope that's a fair answer to your question, Stuart. Okay.
Perfect. Let's go to the next one. This one is from Jim Gibson. Could Allan give a brief description on how the UARL formula was developed over time into the form we now all know? I am particularly interested in how the parameters are chosen. Were any other parameters considered that were eventually left out, and how were the various weighting factors arrived at?
Okay. Hello, Jim. Hi, nice to meet you. The URL equation is a Babe component analysis where we have chosen, or I should say, the first water loss task force with members from Germany, Japan, UK, and USA. After a widespread consultation, looking at data that was available, a lot of data in Germany, on bursts and pipe materials and things like that and so on. And after widespread consultation and acceptance of constructive criticism from specialists following many presentations in other countries over the 5 years, how we should populate a Babe model with different parameters. And we need to have a few, well, first of all, I'll show you the equation, which probably most of you are familiar with. I said to you that you have to dive deep into some of these problems in order to come up with something where you can just bring it back up to the top in a usable form. And the best usable form we found for this is that the UARL in litres per day is a factor times the length of mains, a factor times the number of service connections actually to the main, and then the section of service connection between the main and the edge of the property line is one of the most vulnerable points in many systems around the world. Because it's in the street, it has other services, it has traffic, it has all sorts of potential damages. Around our estate here, there's cars parked with wheels over the pavement, and pavements aren't designed to support half a car. So that's where we get a very high proportion of leakage. So there's quite a big component there just for the number of connections and the section of the pipe up to the property line. And then you can have either zero length of service connection almost, or a very long service connection. So now you have to take into account the actual length of the private pipes. And that was the concept, that we worked out a series of parameters, put them all in the mix, works them all out, and those are the coefficients we got out. And then we assumed a linear relationship between pressure and leak flow rate, which we know is oversimplified. At that time, nobody believed that we would ever get to the stage where you would be able to work out a relationship between pressure and bursts. Right, and we'll go on to that a bit later. But in fact, so what we did, we just used a simple linear relationship. For those of you who use N1, we use N1 equals 1 and assumed that the URL varies linearly with pressure. Okay, next one, Melanie, please. Now, these are the parameters that we came up with. So we have on the mains, working down the left column, mains, service connections, main to property line, and on the service connections themselves. And we came up with unavoidable background. All these are 50 meters pressure, 20 liters per kilometer per hour, 1.25 liters per connection per day, and so on. I won't go into the table in detail, but when we come on to the bursts, we have a frequency of bursts at an average flow rate for a certain number of days. And you can see the figures there. And we have one table for the reported leaks and bursts and one for the unreported leaks and bursts. Now, what we found was, after some time, that we'd rather got the figures wrong for the average flow rate for service pipes, because when in the UK people started to do serious leak repair on service pipes after the 1995 drought, that figure came down very rapidly. And so later on in 2009, we adjusted the flow rate and the days to give the same change of average volume, the same average volume per burst, but with slightly different figures for the flow rate and the duration. Okay. Next one, thank you, Eleni. Now, also, we realized that with this methodology, it would move with time. And our understanding of the boundary conditions for applying this formula would also change. And so we started to look at things, where could we apply this to? What are the limitations on density of connections, on system size, on average pressure? And we came up with the initial figures, Lambert et al. In Aqua in 1999. And then gradually, we found through people using them in the water loss specialist group and so on, that we can move and change these things. So we very quickly came up with the fact that we shouldn't apply this to any system less than 5,000 service connections, that they were too diverse in terms of their characteristics. We also thought at that time we could go down to 25 meters pressure. And then gradually it moved on, it moved on, it moved on. And the big change was in 2009, when we put no lower limit on density of connections, no upper limit. We limited it to closer to 3,000 service connections, and we had a graph for the leak flow rate versus pressure. And now we've moved on even further in a way which I'll describe to you. Next one, please, Lorraine. Okay, if you want to see the overall figures now, then this is what it looks like in simplified form. At 50 meters pressure, the infrastructure component on mains is 480 litres per kilometre per day for unavoidable background leakage, 290 for reported breaks, and 130 for unreported breaks, and so on. And you can see the way that they add up, the different combinations, and that's where you get the 18, the 0.8, and the 25 in the ULL formula. Now, for the typical N1, we used to think it could go up to 2.5, but we think that in most cases now, that's due to either poor location of the average zone point, or the fact that we didn't understand enough about the way that splits could occur. We thought that they could work in 2 dimensions, but generally it's just a linear relationship between area and pressure for some bursts, which I'll move on to now. So we adjusted those limits to 0.5 to 1.5. Next one. So here we are again. As you can see, we're moving on now. And in fact, that table now is in the ISO standard. So it's been recognized that this evolution process has been taking place. And what we recommend now is that it should be UARL if you're within a much closer range of pressures, 45 to 60 meters. You can still use the original ULL formula within that range, and you can still use it if you have more than 5,000 service connections. But outside that, you actually need to look more at the individual characteristics and do a more customized approach. Now, we didn't want to have a complete new ULL formula, so what Kate and I decided we should do is people should start with the standard URL, which many people are using, and then in certain conditions, if they want a more accurate answer or more reliable answer, we can work out a system correction factor for them. In other words, you can say the SCF for this is 0.45. You must multiply the standard one by 0.45, or you must multiply it by 2. And by doing that, we hope to have a virtually seamless transition for people to use. Next one, please. So why is the SCF calculation different? Well, first of all, we bring in FABAD, which is John May's concept, which he introduced in the UK just after we'd finished the managing leakage reports. And in fact, we had been, Stuart will agree, I think, we've been banging our heads on the wall trying to work out why it was that when you change the pressure, some DMAs, it had a big effect on the leak flow rate, and other DMAs, it didn't have as much. And John May came along with his paper, a 1-page paper in World Water, and he said, it's easy. He said, the velocity varies with the square root of the pressure, according to Bernoulli's law, which is about 200 years old. But for some types of materials and some types of bursts, the area of the leak also varies with the pressure linearly. And that means that where you have the left-hand diagram of the split in the plastic pipe, the area is varying with the pressure as well as the velocity. And they have a power 1.5, and the one where you have the cast iron pipe, where there is almost no change in the area, it's 0.5. So we have fixed and variable area discharges. Now, we sorted out that one by 2009. The one below is we realized that in small systems, we were using the average burst frequency for, let's say, a particular water utility would have an average burst frequency of so much, but it varied a lot from year to year. And when you get small random events, which is what bursts are, or what they should be in a well-run system, then what you end up with is that the probability distribution in any single year is skewed. And the correct distribution to use is a Poisson distribution, which was developed in the 1800s. And it also works very well if you're a football supporter and you look at the number of goals scored per game by teams in the Premier League or anywhere else. And what you see, they don't always score 2.5 goals per year, per game. Sometimes they score 1, sometimes 0, sometimes 5, something like that. And annual burst frequencies tend to follow the same kind of thing. And so what we find, it's very skewed. As you get in the middle row of that, as you get down to the lower numbers of bursts per year, you can see how skewed it gets and how the median value falls. But the nice thing about Poisson is there's when you get to more than about 15 bursts per year, it's almost a normal distribution, which is what most people use. So we started to use Poisson distribution. And then finally, with pressure bursts, based upon work starting in 2007, and then a lot of work I did in Australia at the end of the millennium drought, where we looked at pressure reduction on really big systems when they were desperate for water. And we started to find there was definitely a relationship. And what you could do, if you took off excess static pressure, then you could make the burst just drop like a stone. And that little diagram is from one of the regions in Sydney water, and you can see how the pressure burst frequency was varying seasonally. I'm not sure how much was taken off that pressure. It might have been, say, 20 meters, and the burst frequency just dropped like a stone and stayed down. And we've reproduced that ever since 2011 in many different places around the world. We can now predict the zones you should go to actually stop burst dead, where you can do pressure management. And that has been used around the world, and also in the UK, in Anglian water, several years ago. I think it was about 2016, when Stuart, I introduced the concept to Stuart and Andy, forget his second name now, and we picked out about 20 or 30 zones to do the pressure management to reduce burst frequency. And you extend pressure life, you also extend asset life. So these are major improvements that we've made. And if we look now at the next one, which is the next slide, please. When you put all these together, you can take a utility like Sydney Water, or we've also done this for Quebec. For every utility in Quebec, from the tiniest village to the biggest city, we can do it within a utility. We've also done it in Malta, many other countries around the world. We've done about at least 2,000 of these calculations now. And for every individual DMA, from the smallest to the largest, and for every zone, and for every aggregation you've got within your system, you can now work out, based on the pressure, the average zone pressure, based on the type of pressure materials used in FABAD, the density of connections, and so on. This is the kind of scatter you get. So there is no single relationship between pressure and burst. It is very unique, apart from an area between around, you can see the way, if you look at the left-hand scale on the axis, we have a system correction factor of 1 is the 1999 UARL. Generally, in the range of about 5,000 service connections up to about, well, larger values, it will be within about plus or minus 10% of that range. because it knocks out a lot of the individual unique characteristics of the DMAs. But when you get down then to the smaller sizes of DMAs, you can see the way you get a huge scatter. The system correction factor could be anything between 0.4 and 2.0. And you can also see that with the pressure, you get exactly the same kind of thing. And so this technique is now available. It's now being used in an increasing number of utilities and countries. A customized UARL for every bit of your system and for every combined bit of your system. Jim, does that give you an idea of how far we've come?
Jim's on the call.
Is Jim there? No?
Not sure. Let's go to the next one.
Okay. Right.
The next one from,
Okay.
sorry, Alan.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
The next one is from Kate Stanton Davis. Since you met John May in 95, you have strongly supported this FAVAD concept as well as developed methods for reliably predicting the benefits of reduction of transients and excess pressures on bus frequency. And the essential? Oh, it's cut it here, sorry. We had some problems with this question, just a minute. I think it's lost something here.
Want to go on to the next one, Melanie, and I'll pick it up.
I can have it here if you just give me 1 minute.
Shall I read it out? Because I've got it in front of me.
Sorry?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I can read it out. Okay. Methods for reliably predicting the benefits of reduction of transients and excess pressures on burst frequency, and the essential part that this plays in sustainable leakage management. Would you like to expand on this a little? Okay.
Thank you, Alan.
I can't put this in because I'm always talking about John May. If it wasn't for John May, we wouldn't be anywhere close to where we are now. So here's the answer. During the 1991-95 UK National Leakage Control Initiative, the most experienced specialists in the UK water industry, whether UK Water Research and UK Water Research Centre specialists, tried but failed to come up with a logical reason why leak flow rates at night were very sensitive to excess pressure reduction in some DMA tests, but much less in others. And I must admit, we all make mistakes, and we all ought to admit our mistakes and when we've missed something obvious. And I admit, as someone with hydraulics knowledge and training, that my suggestion fell a long way short because I resorted to using an empirical equation, and I didn't look at it as something that should be looked at as physical equations of flow. When the managed leakage reports were being printed, I went to a presentation where John May, who was an independent engineer working with his own hydraulics lab, had noted that some individual leaks appeared to increase much more with pressure than others. And he ascribed that to some leaks having a fixed area with the velocity of flow varying with pressure to the power 0.5, as in classical theory. But other leaks, the area also varied linearly with pressure, so that the flow rate in volume per hour varied with pressure to 1.5. Now, this is a real for those of you who watch American TV, this was a real Homer Simpson moment. All the best brains in the UK have been trying to work that out, and it was so simple. And we often find that many of the things that we eventually find out, we just think, well, how did we possibly miss that? And so one of the things we should keep on thinking as we're trying to improve our understanding is, are we missing something important? Because certainly in National Leakage Control Initiative, we did. Now, in the same presentation, John happened to mention that he'd done some tests on a few DMAs in the UK and found that when maximum pressures were reduced, mains burst frequencies had fallen significantly. And I suddenly realized that the National Leakage Control Initiative had never included this possibility in the study. Nobody dreamt that it was happening. Your bursts were like an act of God, and if they were bursting too much, you change your pipes. in Welsh region, we looked at our data and we thought it was probably a cubic relationship. Burst frequency varied with the maximum static pressure cubed. And this was dismissed straight away by most people as fanciful. It was tested on small DMAs with low and variable burst numbers and not proven in the UK. And then as I worked around the world, I began to find other isolated examples in Australia, Italy, and UK. And then Dave Pearson did a retrospective analysis on some of his data in United Utilities. And we found it did happen. That burst frequencies in some situations are very sensitive. So the members of the pressure management group of the Second Water Loss Task Force started to collect before and after burst frequencies from 2005. And Julian Thornton and I started to develop concepts. There was one called the straw that breaks the camel's back, to identify zones and DMAs, to identify and prioritize zones which would yield significant reductions in burst frequencies on mains and or services. And I stress this, sometimes you get the burst reductions on mains, sometimes you get them on services only, and sometimes you get them on both. Brazil contributed a lot of data on this, and we started to use them to target zones in Australia during the Millennium Drought, and then in South Africa, and then in more and more countries. And they're now included in the predictions in the URL with SCF approach. And in fact, when you bring this in and you take into account the extension of asset life, these are the savings that totally dominate the economic case for doing pressure management. They're massively greater than the ones that we normally calculate due to the a loss of money that's been put into a leak going at a higher rate. In other words, you don't just get a 10% in leak flow rates. You actually stop a number of bursts stone dead, and you can predict this. As I'll show you in a moment. So unfortunately, there are many countries who are still unaware of this or don't wish to accept it. They think this is off the wall. I don't believe this could happen. We would have seen this before if it happened. Anyway, it was my great privilege to work collaboratively with John May for almost 10 years. Unfortunately, he died far too young. And these developments are the true tribute to his research. And together with Julian Thornton, Tim Waldron, Mark Shepherd, Ronnie McKenzie, Paul Fanner, and Alain Lalonde, I've hopefully been able to encourage many, but sadly not yet all, of our international management community to adopt them. Okay, so that's my eulogy to John May. He started us off. He was the one who kick-started us. Good on you, John. as the Australians say, good on you. Right, we're on now to the next set of questions. Melanie?
Let's go there. Now we have a few questions from Ahmad Samha Daud. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce it correctly well. From Allan's 60-year career journey and experience, what are his thoughts on the current level of non-revenue water knowledge among water engineers? From my observation and training experience, many engineers tend to focus heavily on technology while lacking a solid foundation in theoretical non-revenue water concepts such as FAVAD, HWF, ILI, and others. Do you agree that engineers should be equipped with a strong understanding of these fundamentals before moving on to more advanced technologies and tools?
Very quick, straight answer, I definitely agree. When I was water manager in North Wales, we had specialist teams for water loss control, working out of depots very close to where we were. They knew the area intimately. They were knowledgeable and interested. We had regular discussions about the work and the knowledge. And after 1995, when I did assignments with other water companies in the UK and internationally, my first action nearly always was to ask, can I go to the depot? Can I talk to the people who fix the bursts? Can I find out from their hands-on invaluable knowledge what they see as being wrong with the systems? and it was wonderful information. Now we've got more remote and automatic data collection and presentation, and this type of contact and exchange of knowledge seems to become less and less evident. There are many large gaps between the way academics approach leakage using mathematics, which many practitioners don't comprehend. So I've tried to present the concepts in a way that are based on sound principles, but presented in ways which are easy for practitioners who I may never meet to use. Kate and I think that the online self-study courses on good practices in our management are recently available with facilities for multi-language options, and that may be a way of going forward. Idle doesn't apparently get involved with training, but Roland Limburger did develop EasyCalcs, so he could have, and it's now been updated by Dave Pearson. But in fact, Kate now is gradually developing modules with software, commercial software bought from other places, which can try to get these principles to a wider audience and very quickly get them translated automatically into different languages, and then just a quick checkout. His next question was regarding the, as we're getting a bit short on time, Eleni, I'll run through these now. Regarding the infrastructure leakage index formula, UALL is 18 times LM plus 0.8 times NC and 25 times LP. The question is, can we assume that LP, the length of private pipes, is 0 in all cases? Well, the 3 terms in the brackets represent, retrospectively, the 18 is the components on mains. The 25 is from the utility-owned service connection from the main to a meter at the edge of the street. Now, if the meter is at the street edge, you should omit the 3rd term, because that becomes part of the consumption passing through the meter. If the meter is located some distance after the edge of the street, then the 3rd ULL component comes into it, and it depends on the length of the private underground pipe in the LP term. Now, we do have a version of the ULL equation where you can adjust the coefficient of 0.8 for NC to allow for the extra average length of underground pipes. But we don't normally publish that equation because it does tend to confuse people. But I think this is a way we're going to have to go forward now. We're going to have different coefficients for the 2nd term, the NC term, which relate to the average length of pipe per connection. It's doable because we've done it, but we just haven't presented it before. 3rd one, on the...
Let me tell you something. If it's not a problem for you, we can stay a little bit later. Don't worry about that.
Okay, thank you. Let me go back.
Yeah, please brief. We do have time. And if some people need to leave the presentation, it will be available on YouTube channel later on, not this week, but next week. And so it's not a problem. You can take a break. Don't worry about that.
Okay, right. 3rd question was about calculating the R-day factor. In DMAs used in flow modulated pressure control, the R-day factor can vary significantly between the DMA inlet and the critical point, often exceeding 30 hours per day at the inlet, while remaining around 24 hours a day at the critical point. Now, I was surprised by this question because I've only ever used our day factors, or night day factors, I prefer to call them, based upon pressure measurements at the average zone point. I've never seen people do a calculation based on the inlet point and then at the critical point. And I can tell you, it just won't work. You're introducing errors. A figure here is quoted of they often exceed 30 hours per day. They can be much more than that. But there are ways of doing these calculations, but you must have an AZP pressure. Now, if you think about a very simple example of why they don't work, if you have an inlet point and a critical point. If the ground slopes away from your inlet, then the first property, which might be just close to the PRV, is also the critical point. So in other words, your critical point and your inlet point are exactly the same. So how could it possibly work? Because it takes no account of the topography after that point. We do have a free it's a guideline report from about 10 years ago, which I'm not sure is on the Leake Street Library website, but I did it with Allan Lambert some 10 years ago. And we'll get the reference to that so you can see some of the issues. The next bits my reply is that, as well, modulating to keep a constant pressure of the critical point can result in large fluctuations of pressure at the inlet points, which have been shown to sometimes cause joint failures close to the inlet. Now, this is something that Julian Thornton found in South Africa, because the pipes at the inlet are not necessarily designed to be subject to large fluctuations in pressure. And he suggested in such cases that modulating to the AZP point as an option may be worthwhile in those particular cases. So some people might like to follow that up. Next question was, the RDI factor tends to be even higher when using time modulated pressure control. Yes, indeed. We've seen values in Bahamas where the pressure is almost shut down at night of up to 100 hours per day for the hour-day factor. If the AZP average zone point data is not available and two different data points are used, or you calculate it for the inlet and the critical point, then the resulting daily calculation could be very much inaccurate, just depending upon the topography of the zone. So in such cases, what is the recommended approach? It's the same message that we've been giving now for 25 years. But if you're going to use these methods, you must measure at the AZP point. There is no other way of doing it because the methods won't work, and you may as well stick your thumb in the air and take a guess, because you may spend time doing tests, and if you don't do the tests properly, and if you don't use the pressure at the AZP point, or you've chosen the AZP point wrong, or you don't wait until such time, if you're doing night flow analysis, when things stabilize, then you're wasting your time. You are literally wasting your time and your efforts. If there's AZP data is available and logged, would the resulting hour-day factor be considered accurate and appropriate? Yes, but with caution, because we now know that the N1 power varies with the average zone pressure. Just let that sink in. It isn't constant. If you do an N1 test and you come up with an N1 value of 1.1, if you change the pressure, then the N1 value will change. Unless it's very close to 0.5. If it's very close to 0.5, then it can't really change very much at all. But otherwise, it will change. So this is going to influence all the calculations, and we also have the individual zones may have different N1 values. Now, the checking procedure for this can be rather complex, but the way of approaching it is to get profiles at the AZP point and to analyze them and say, is this profile going to end up giving a fairly uniform value, or a fairly uniform ratio? The checking procedure, you can actually get guidance on this from one of the home pages on the WLRNA website. So this is now a technique which is being used, and because an N1 test is quite a thing to do properly, quite a lot of effort, then the technique is to start to take profiles of average pressure at the AZP point, and then to analyze them and say, do I really need to do an N1 test, or can I assume that the N1 is close to 1? And if you can assume that the N1 is close to 1, then you're okay. You don't necessarily need to do an N1 test. So it's a step that says, do I need to do an N1 test, or do I not need to do an N1 test? Yeah. What's the opinion on leakage step testing? I've come across several, this is the question, I've come across several areas where new leaks appeared after completing the step test, along with water quality concerns. Should this raise concern, and should the method be reevaluated and possibly discontinued? Okay. Well, leakage step testing was very, very popular in the UK in large DMAs in the 1980s and early 1990s. And I simply don't know how much it's used now in the UK or elsewhere. However, it can involve a lot of valving in a comparatively short time, creating changes in pressure in the sub-DMAs and transients, pressure transients, if the valves are operated too quickly. I have seen a test in North America where the transient has been recorded and the tester asked me what it was. Now just think about that. If you don't understand, if you're trying to do too complex a test and to do it too quickly, in other words, if you're not doing it following a standardized, documented procedure, then that's the kind of thing which happened. And so for me, it's unsurprising that the new leaks sometimes occur after a step test. So testers need to be trained. Arthur Oscott in the UK used to say, each time we fix a burst, several more come to its funeral, which was a nice way of putting this. I also saw some years ago in Italy, the transients were actually being created to try to identify the presence of bursts. You're putting transients in to actually try to identify where you've got bursts. Now this seems to be the long way around, but there we are. Now for some good news. Some years ago, Halifax Water in Canada started a process of investigating every burst to see if it might have been caused by their own actions. And they found in some cases that they were being caused by their own actions. And so therefore, they were able to make a big improvement in the operational procedures. Next one, pressure management is typically focused on reducing excess pressure. However, pressure transients and pressure variations between day and night are also key contributors to pipeline failures. Should pressure management strategies place greater emphasis on mitigating transients and variations as part of core discipline knowledge? Well, any positive action to test for, identify, mitigate, and wherever possible eliminate transients should be a first priority in pressure management. And we found that transients can also be caused by customers. And we found that this occurring in many situations internationally. So that not even systems supplied by gravity can be assumed to be free of transients. They will not be identified from 15 minutes average pressure readings. You need a special pressure recorder measuring over very small time periods, preferably for 1 week minimum, just in case you have a once a week customer transient situation, like someone in a factory is suddenly closing a valve into a local storage tank. And the questioner asks, expanding the definition of pressure management to include these factors would still support the 4 arrows leakage reduction strategy, where pressure control is a key element. It also complements the PALM method, prevent, aware, locate, mend, particularly under the prevent pillar, where addressing pressure instability is crucial. Yeah, I think Julian Thornton did do a definition of pressure management, a written one, some time ago. I'm not quite sure from memory what the one is in the IWA manual. So it might be worthwhile passing that question on to Dave Pearson and Julian. And then finally, among the 3, excess pressures, transients, and variations, which do you believe contributes the most to pipeline failure? Well, I don't think there's a standard answer. It's specific to each system or subsystem. Check for transients first, and then for excess static maximum pressures, and predict if reductions in bursts are likely. Now you may say, how do I predict if reduction in bursts are likely? Well, we've done it for angry and water and picked out the top 20 DMAs or zones where there was a higher certainty of reducing. And this is a case you're seeing now from Durban Central Business District. And this is a job that Mark Shepherd did. And what we did was we used our prediction methods to predict what the burst would come down to when the pressure reduction was made. In other words, we made the predictions before the work was done. And the purple line shows the average beforehand. The mains bursts were 30 per 100 kilometers per year, and they went down to 13. And the service pipes were 27 per 1,000 services per year, and they went down to 18. And we compared them with the methods that Julian and I developed. The 2007 straw that broke the camel's back, and the latest prediction methods, which actually look at current burst frequencies. So you can see, you can predict. It isn't, what's the word I'm looking for? It isn't impossible. It's doable. It's being done. This was 2013. This is 12 years ago. We can give many examples of this kind of thing. You just have to ask the right person who has been actually doing this. So for me now, I honestly see that looking for places where you can reduce excess bursts is the first thing you should look for after looking for transients. And then limit variations in pressure to small or gentle reductions, and perhaps on a seasonal basis at times of low demand, small reductions in pressure will reduce leak flow rates as burst frequency is very sensitive to static pressure. How are we going on, Mulaney? Michael Wilmot. Yes, okay.
Yep.
Lots of DMAs have pressure recorded at the inlet point and the control point, but not at the average zonal point, AZP. In your opinion, what are the benefits of measuring leakage at the AZP point? Do you feel as a leakage community, we make enough use of pressure drop tests? I think you probably know the answer already. I cannot understand for the life of me, when we've got all these models that work so well internationally, why people still think I don't need an average zone point, because the models need that data. If you don't have that data, then you can't use them. Now, if Michael's referring to the UK, I think this has been a serious blind spot for 25 years, that the utilities don't systematically and haven't established AZP points in all the DMAs and use them to interpret the data. One of the problems about the UK is that in general, starting with ILI, that they have not felt able to accept really any of the big developments in the IWA international work, because they were not carried out with UK data. They had a kind of a rule that the only things that could be used in the UK for improving methodologies were if they had been tested on UK data. I think that's, in my experience, everyone is entitled to make a choice, but it's up to people to make their own choice. But the cost of establishing and monitoring an AZP point now was very expensive 20 years ago, but now it's so small that it's almost a kind of a rounding error. Now, with pressure drop tests, N1 tests in IWA terminology, you would now be amazed by the amount of information that can be derived from well-constructed, carefully carried out N1 tests based on strict protocols for selection of time periods to get when you have stable average zone pressures and night flows. And you choose particular days and seasons, days of the week and seasons of the year when you can get that stability. You don't just go in and change the pressures at 11 o'clock at night one night and get an answer out and use the figures. We can also, with those tests, easily identify if you've got leaking boundary valves. And both Mark Shepherd and myself have found cases where we've done an M1 test or had one done, and we've said you got leaking boundary valve, and someone says, no, we haven't, they've all been checked. And lo and behold, the M1 test tells you you have a leaking boundary valve. What we can also get from that is we can also do continuous splitting of zone inflows into leakage and consumption in real time using N1 that varies with pressure. And we've done that, Kate, now in Mexico. What was Mark saying? We made a list this morning.
Certain parts of Africa.
South Africa.
We've done some trials.
Two places in the Far East.
Some trials in the UK.
Yeah. So this is being done. This is state of the art. Do you think smart revenue? This is the last one you'll be glad to hear.
We did receive another one this morning that I have here. Sent me from husband. We have another one after that. That Kate sent
okay,
me.
that's right. That's right. Okay. Do you think the smart revenue meters, which can provide hourly consumption data, will change how we detect and report leakage? Well, I did have the opportunity to look at one of the first smart meter. Well, I think it was the first one in Australia, on a township of about 20,000 in around 2010, with meters at the edge of the street. The team I worked with are hoping that by deducting the sum of the customer meters night flows from the district meter input at the time of minimum night flow, we'd at last be able to get a reliable estimate of the distribution leakage at night. Unfortunately, due to a combination of circumstances arising from very low leakage and the minimum needed response of customer and district meters, it turned out that we got a negative figure. There was more water being taken out of the area or being taken out by customers than there was going in. So I would say don't presume that all the data you might get from smart metering will automatically give you better data for night flow analysis. If it does, and you are aware of this problem of minimum registration for the meters you have, then you probably have a chance, but it won't work everywhere. And discrimination of night flow, minimum night flows on the customer meters is also important, because if you just show them in 1 meter cube per hour, 2 meters cube per hour, 3 meters cube per hour, you're not going to pick up small differences in consumption at night, like leaking toilets and so on. I think the biggest advantage is going to be timeliness of data acquisition, and that external metering will mean that the leakage on the customer's pipes will become part of the consumption. And I think that is the absolute best way for it to be done. It will avoid the necessity for estimates, and it will correctly attribute all customer leakage as part of the consumption. It also becomes easy to identify leaks on private underground services and within properties, for example, toilets, from persistent high night flows in individual properties. But this means that the utility needs to proactively assist customers with technical support to get the leaks repaired quickly. Because if they're not fixed quickly, then you're not gaining any advantage. Just as a matter of interest, on one occasion, a property being used as a cannabis factory was identified from smart metering. And I think there's been an example, at least one example in America. Are we done now? Yeah. One more.
We do have one last question sent beforehand by email, and I was just saving all the questions that we have in the chat here. The last one will be from Hasvan Bondok. In Alba County, Romania, where I live, the regional water utility publicly reported the following figures for 2023. 30.9% of water losses in the transport and distribution systems, 7.2 cubic meters per kilometer per day of physical losses, total water network length of 2,500 kilometers. Are these levels of water loss considered acceptable based on international standards or IWA performance benchmarks?
Right. From these, I know that some people are looking for a single figure, to measure and compare leakage. This is very, very difficult to do from the two parameters. There are certain questions or certain information that ought to be available as supplementary information so that you can interpret this data. And the things I would ask for, what is the density of connections or the number of connections? In other words, what does the network look like? Does it have a density of connections which is very low or very high? The second one is, whereabouts are the customer meters located? And then some quality control figures. Are you using the number of physical connections to the mains, or are you using the number of billed accounts? Because if you have a lot of flats and apartments, then the number of billed accounts will be much greater than the number of physical connections to the mains. So with any set of data, I would never want to. I would want to know some additional figures to get a feel for the whole system. I don't think you can ever boil it down to a single figure. But what I would say is thank you very much for having the courage to put your figures up here and to join in the conversation.
Okay, so as I said earlier, if we had time available, we would have the answers to the chat questions. Unfortunately, we are already well past the initial times, but I appreciate all the questions sent. Allan, it looks like we will need another webinar for further questions.
Okay.
Would you like before the yeah, please, before we finish the okay.
So can you guess which football team I support? Okay, I guess you can. But I was thinking when I saw this photograph, you know, this reminds me of the Water Loss Specialist Group in some ways. We have a band of people, very diverse people from many different countries, all combining in an effort to get better and better and better. And we have many supporters who want us to succeed, the people around the world who want to improve their leakage. And we've got a very good track record so far. And now we're reaching the stage of maturity after 25 years or so, where the older members, like myself and one or two others, we've, if you like, reached and passed our peak. We can help to mentor, we can help to pass information on, but it's the younger people now who are in this organization that can drive it forward. And there is plenty of scope for improvement, plenty of scope. I wish you success, and I hope you have just as much fun as I've had in the last 25 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Allan. So I want to thank everyone for participating in this special webinar, and a special thank you to Allan and Kate for all the help in organizing this webinar. So Kate, now we can see you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Elaine. You're very welcome.
Yeah.
Very welcome.
Thank you, everybody. who joined the webinar, and it will be available on YouTube channel next week, okay? Thank you again, Allan. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Okay, good.
Bye.
Thank you,
Goodbye,
Allan.
everyone.